Okay, but then I would start.
So,
good morning.
Yeah, I'll just introduce you, Georg. I know that you have in a slide introducing with more detail. I have sent an email informing about your talk. As I said, Georg is a professor of civil law at the University of Saarlandes. Is a specialist, particularly has been engaged fully on the debate about the responsibility of AI, has many important papers on the subject, and we had the pleasure last semester to in the graduate course at the University of São Paulo to share a course on AI and responsibility, which was very, very fruitful. And we are organizing ourselves to publish a book on this subject, gathering the papers by the students of this graduate course on AI. So please, Georg, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Juliano, for this very kind introduction. And good morning, everyone. I would like to briefly introduce myself. Almost everything has been said. I just want to mention that I was member of the EU Commission Expert Group on Liability and New Technologies, and I will refer to the work of this group later. I'm professor of law at Saarlandes University in Germany and also director of the Institute of Legal Informatics at Saarlandes University. And let me briefly mention the work of the Institute. We are involved in research in almost any of the aspects of new technologies with a focus on AI. On the slides that you will see, we have the logo of some of our current projects, and you can read by the names that is very much related to AI. We are also involved in education with our own master degree, IT and law, which is offered in German language at this moment only. And with our international summer school, IT law and legal informatics, Professor Maranhão was kindly teaching a few years ago. It will be held from next Monday on. That's why I'm rather busy today. If you're interested, please have a look at our website. I would like to mention that on August 9th in the afternoon, we will organize a public workshop on AI in the judiciary. And I would like to invite you to this workshop. I would forward the invitation to you, Juliano, and please feel free to share it, since this workshop will be held as like the whole summer school in English. Today, I would like to have a very short, condensed talk based on my own research in the past few years on aspects of liability for AI. In Europe, we have an intensive discussion on the legal framework for AI, which was starting with the European Commission's strategy paper AI for Europe of 2018. In the following, the Commission was establishing several expert groups on different aspects of AI, among them the expert group on liability and new technologies. What is interesting is that the expert group published a report in December 2019, which was referred to later by the European Parliament as well as by the Commission. The European Parliament suggested in its resolution of October 2020, called the Civil Liability Regime for AI Intelligence, the introduction of a specific instrument regarding the liability of operators of AI systems, introducing strict liability. I will come back to this. In 2021, we had the proposal for an AI Act in a certain, which is a parallel to the probably Brazilian AI Act. It's important to mention here that the AI Act does not contain any specific rule on liability, since that was supposed to be regulated by later pieces of legislation. And last year, in September 2020, the European Commission came up with a package of 2 legislative acts. One being the proposal for a new directive on liability for defective products. I will refer to this as the PLD, Product Liability Directive. So, and by way of background, we have product liability based off an existing product liability directive, which was enacted back in the 1980s, and that should be revised now with a special focus on new technologies. At the same time, in September 2022, the Commission published its proposal for a directive on non-contractual liability for AI systems, the so-called AI Liability Directive. I will come back to both of these instruments in a minute. For an overall view on the current European discussion, we can say that we are discussing intensively the various aspects of liability for AI, and that discussion has reached a somehow decisive stage after the opening of the legislative procedures by the European Commission. In my view, there are 2 pivotal aspects in this discussion. One is regarding the concept or the legal basis of liability, where we have as a contrast the concept of strict liability versus the traditional fault-based liability, which we know from our tort law. And on the other hand, I would like to mention that there's also a debate, an important question regarding the addressee of such liability. Should the primarily liable party be the operator or of an AI system rather than its manufacturer, or vice versa? That's also a very important question. And what we see is that we have different views in both aspects. Regarding the concept or legal base of liability, the expert group, as well as the European Parliament, advocated for the introduction of strict liability in some cases, namely in the case of so-called high-risk AI systems, whereas the EU Commission, according to its proposal for an AI liability directive, wishes to stay with the traditional fault-based liability. Also, regarding the addressee of liability, we find rather different views in the discussion, whereas the expert group and the European Parliament were focusing on the liability of the operator. The EU Commission is stressing the liability of the manufacturer rather than the one of the operator. The basic question that I want to discuss with a few headlines would be: do we need new legislation at all? Are there any important gaps in existing liability law? And if so, should we introduce strict liability? And if so, should we address the operator or the manufacturer in first place? Regarding the question of whether and what kind of gaps we have in liability regime for AI systems, I think we should focus on the characteristics of an AI system. So the question would be, what makes an AI system so special that it would deserve specific rules on liability? And in my view, we do indeed find a very specific characteristic which makes a difference between AI systems and traditional machines, and that is something I would like to call behavior. Behavior, in that sense, I would like to define as the ability to choose actions depending on a perceived situation. In the example of the steam engine, which is a very dangerous machine, actually causing many fatal injuries after its introduction in the 19th century, we can see that the function of a steam engine does not depend on any perception of the engine itself, since it didn't have any sensors for it, whereas a self-driving car is required to perceive its environment and to choose action based on this environment all the time. But any minute of the functioning, the self-driving car will have to watch its environment and to make to choose driving actions depending on that perception. That's an important difference in my view, which leads to some important questions regarding traditional tort law. Under traditional tort law, liability requires fault, and fault is defined as human behavior. Whenever a machine is showing behavior, such as choosing actions in the case of a self-driving car, it doesn't show any fault, since machines are not capable of culpability, as it is a human-based or human-related concept. Also, we do not have comprehensive strict liability in our legal regimes, and for this reason, we can state that there are indeed gaps in liability with regard to liability caused by AI systems due to their behavior. And the thesis I want to make up here is that this gap will become bigger in the future as the more autonomously an AI system is able to function, the bigger the autonomous range will be and the bigger that gap will be necessarily. From this position, some follow-up questions I will raise. One would be regarding the traditional fault-based liability. Could we close this gap by way of introducing monitoring obligations? And if that is not possible, what are the other options? Before I go into detail with this, I would like to briefly introduce the draft AI Liability Directive. You will certainly have had a look on it, but and probably if you did so, you would be surprised, I guess. The draft Liability Directive is rather short, containing only 12 articles, and within that 12 articles, only 2, Article 3 and 4, having a content relevant to liability. And the 2 articles are covering very different aspects of liability. Article 3 is covering the question of collection of information and is granting a right to disclosure of evidence to a potential claimant, which can be triggered against any potential defendant in the case of damage caused by AI systems. Article 4 is making up a presumption of a causal link in the case of fault, and I will come back to this in a minute. It does not, and that's important, it does not establish any independent and separate legal basis for liability. It does not open regulating any monitoring duties of anyone, not of the operator nor of the manufacturer of an AI system. For this, in these cases, it just refers to the national laws of the member states. So that's very important to keep in mind. There's no additional basis for liability according to this concept. So it all refers to the question how important the presumption according to Article 4 will be. And here we have an interesting finding. The presumption is laid down in Article 4, paragraph 1, and it establishes the presumption of a causal link between the fault of the defendant and the function of the AI system. And that's indeed an important element, since in some cases we have we are having the so-called black box effect that you might have heard of, which is related to systems based on machine learning. That black box effect means that we do not know why a AI system is acting in a certain way. And that's crucial in the case of fault-based liability, since if you don't know why the AI system was functioning in a certain way, we can also not know what had happened if the defendant had behaved in a different way. So the causal link between the fault, the behavior of the human, and the function of the AI system is always unclear. And here, definitely, the presumption will help to fill this gap. What is the problem about Article 4 is that the prerequisite for these such presumption is that fault has been demonstrated by the claimant. So only in a case where the court is convinced that the defendant had committed fault or shown faulty behavior, that presumption for the causal link will be established. And that is a very strong limitation of its effect. And interesting, there's no such presumption for fault except for a very specific case, which is that the defendant did not provide information. Outside of this, we do not have the very important presumption for fault. And in my view, that here's the title if you want to look back, but to summarize on the Liability Directive, according to the draft published by the European Commission, it certainly offers some measures to improve the enforceability of legal claims in the case of AI systems. However, it does not close the important gaps in liability at all. Let me come back to the monitoring duties for a minute. The question is, could we close the gap in existing tort law by applying monitoring duties to the operator? Such monitoring duties could be derived from traditional tort law by way of case law. It could also be derived from the AI Act. To cut it short, in my view, that would not be a convincing idea, since if the human would have to comprehensively and intensively monitor an AI system, the biggest advantage of such system, the ability to behave independently, autonomously, would be lost again. And for this reason, in the European AI Act, in my view, rightly aims to reduce monitoring duties. Actually, the AI Act, the draft AI Act, does not regulate any monitoring duties in the case of so-called normal AI systems. It establishes some monitoring duties in the case of high-risk AI systems, but at the same time is limiting the duties. It mainly will be enough to follow the instructions and to monitor the functioning of a system and to react if a malfunction is visible. That's very low-level monitoring duties, and in my view, rightly is so. That also means that establishing monitoring duties is not an instrument to close the liability gap. I would skip attribution since I would not like to run out of time. Regarding the liability of the manufacturer, the new PLD offers an interesting concept. First of all, it's comprehensively applicable to AI systems, as the new PLD will cover software of any kind, and AI systems come along by way of software. What the most important element, in my view, is a reversal of the burden of proof by way of presumption laid down in Article 9 of the draft new PLD. Here, as I read it, the draft PLD will establish the reversal of the burden of proof in the case of a misfunction, which I would interpret as covering faulty behavior. So whenever the AI systems would show some faulty behavior, like driving against the rules in the case of a self-driving car, that would trigger the presumption for a product defect and result in a reversal of the burden of proof. In my view, this is not only of practical importance, but it's also establishing the bridge between behavior and a product defect, which is crucial in the case of AI systems. There are some limitations. The PLD is not applicable to damage to property of entities other than consumers. So in particular, where an AI system would cause damage to a company, PLD will not be applicable. So the gaps is closed only partly, I would say. What about strict liability? Strict liability was suggested by the European Parliament by way of introducing strict liability of the operator in a list-based approach, so that strict liability would be applicable only to explicitly named cases which would be covered by an annex to the regulation, and that annex could be amended by the European Commission, so be updated regularly. There are important advantages of strict liability. It offers liability in case of lack of fault, so we would fill the gap of traditional fault-based liability. It also offers efficient incentives for prevention of damages. It reduces litigation risk and also would lead to incentivize the activity level, since the more the AI system will be used, the bigger the risk, and also the easier strict liability would be covered. By a limitation of the strict liability, it's also open to insurance cover. For this reason, I'm totally with the EU Parliament. It's a good concept. It is mentioned in the discussion that liability might have some chilling effects on the development and use of AI systems. And in my view, this is true. This argument is a good one, as far as there is no insurance cover for such liability. So insurability is certainly a precondition of strict liability. That's why it should be introduced by way of a list-based approach. Last point, if I may add 1 minute, Giuliano, is the question of who should be the addressee of such strict liability. We have different concepts. Should it be producer or the operator? In my view, we need a differentiating solution here. The addressee should be determined according to its ability to control the risk, and in some cases, certainly that will be the manufacturer. In other cases, that will certainly be the operator. In the case of a list-based approach, it will also be possible to address either or both of them. Just by way of example, to cut it short, in this case of a self-driving car, we do have strict liability of the operator under traditional German law by way of the Road Traffic Act, and the same system is in place in many jurisdictions worldwide. What I suggested several years ago is to add the strict liability of the car manufacturer, as in the case of self-driving cars operating on public roads. The ability to control risks on the part of the driver is reduced to almost zero, whereas the ability of the producer to control the risk is much higher than with a traditional car. That's why the correct addressee in the case of self-driving car would be the manufacturer. It's also adequate to address the operator, since the operator is the one who controls the activity level by determining what time, which route, and how often he or she would use the car. I think I would stop here with my last slide. As I said, a differentiating solution would be required. It is interesting at the example of the self-driving car that Mercedes-Benz made a statement recently that it would accept strict liability for any damage caused by his newly produced level 3 car. So it seems that the industry has recognized that accepting the liability in this cases might be adequate. Sorry, I was a bit short here, but I would like to come to the conclusion. In my view, we have important gaps in fault-based liability when it comes to AI systems, and the draft AI liability directive does not close the gaps at all. In my view, we still need the introduction of strict liability, as it would offer important advantage compared to the traditional legal regime. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Georg. It's very clarifying presentation about the structure, and your criticisms are